The moment I walked into that conference room with my patent certificate in hand, I knew my boss's blonde mistress had no idea what was about to hit her. After 3 years of watching her manipulate her way up the corporate ladder through Richard's bed, she thought she could finally push me out of my own project. But sometimes the quiet ones have the biggest surprises waiting. My name is David Chun, and I've been working as a senior product developer at Technovision Industries in downtown Seattle for the past 5 years. The rain was particularly heavy that October morning when everything changed, matching the storm that was about to hit our office. I had always been the type to keep my head down, focus on my work, and let my innovations speak for themselves. That approach had served me well until Melissa Sterling walked into our lives. But before we dive into this story, I have some incredible news to share with you. We're giving away a brand new motorcycle to celebrate reaching our subscriber milestone. All you need to do is subscribe to this channel, give this video a thumbs up, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. The winner will be announced next month, so don't miss your chance to ride away with an amazing prize. Melissa had joined Technovision as a marketing coordinator 18 months ago, fresh out of business school with perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes, and an attitude that screamed ambition. Within weeks, she had caught the attention of our 52-year-old CEO, Richard Blackwood, a recently divorced father of 2 who was going through what his ex-wife probably called a midlife crisis. What started as professional meetings quickly turned into lunch dates, then weekend conferences that somehow only required the 2 of them. The office gossip mill went into overdrive almost immediately. Sandra from accounting mentioned seeing them together at an expensive restaurant downtown on a Tuesday night. Mike from IT noticed they were staying late together more frequently, supposedly working on strategic planning. But it was Jennifer from Human Resources who delivered the most damaging information during one of our coffee breaks. She had seen them arriving at the office together in Richard's BMW on multiple occasions, with Melissa clearly wearing the same clothes from the previous day. I had been working on a revolutionary project for 2 years before Melissa arrived. It was a smart home integration system that could learn user preferences and automatically adjust everything from temperature to lighting to security settings. The technology was groundbreaking, combining artificial intelligence with Internet of Things devices in a way that hadn't been achieved before. I had invested countless nights and weekends perfecting the algorithms, testing prototypes, and documenting every aspect of the development process. The development phase had been incredibly challenging and rewarding. I remember spending entire weekends in the lab, surrounded by circuit boards, sensors, and computer screens displaying endless lines of code. My girlfriend Sarah would bring me sandwiches and coffee, shaking her head at my obsession but understanding how important this project was to me. The breakthrough moments were euphoric, like when I finally solved the pattern recognition algorithm that allowed the system to predict user behavior with 93% accuracy. The technical challenges were immense. I had to create a machine learning framework that could process data from dozens of different device types, each with their own communication protocols and data formats. The system needed to be secure enough to protect users' privacy while being flexible enough to adapt to new devices and changing preferences. I filed detailed development logs every day, documenting each breakthrough, each failure, and each iteration of the design. The Seattle tech scene was notoriously competitive, and I knew that being first to market with this technology could change everything for Technovision. We were a mid-sized company trying to compete with giants like Amazon and Google, and this product could be our breakthrough. Richard had initially been supportive, providing resources and encouraging my research. He would stop by my workspace regularly, asking detailed questions about the progress and expressing genuine excitement about the potential applications. During those early days, Richard seemed genuinely invested in my success. He approved additional funding for specialized equipment, allowed me to hire 2 junior developers to assist with the coding, and even arranged for me to attend conferences where I could present preliminary findings to industry experts. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with several venture capitalists expressing interest in the technology and asking about potential licensing opportunities. Melissa's influence over Richard became increasingly obvious to everyone in the office. She would sit in on executive meetings despite her junior position, offer opinions on technical matters she clearly didn't understand, and somehow always find ways to insert herself into important conversations. The other employees began to whisper, but nobody dared to speak up directly. Richard was known for his quick temper and his tendency to fire people who questioned his decisions. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Richard started asking Melissa to review technical reports before they reached his desk, despite her complete lack of engineering background. She would attend client meetings that had nothing to do with marketing, offering input on product specifications and development timelines. Most disturbing of all, she began requesting copies of confidential research documents, claiming she needed them to develop marketing strategies for products that were still years away from completion. I started noticing small changes in how my project was being discussed in company meetings. Where Richard used to speak enthusiastically about the revolutionary potential of smart home integration, he began emphasizing the risks and challenges instead. Melissa would nod approvingly when he expressed concerns about development costs or market readiness, clearly reinforcing his newfound skepticism about my work. The first red flag came during a quarterly review meeting 6 months ago. Melissa had been promoted to senior marketing manager, a position that typically required years of experience. She used her new authority to question the viability of my smart home project, suggesting that the company should focus on more proven technologies instead of risky innovations. Her words stung because I knew she was essentially calling my life's work worthless in front of the entire leadership team. During that meeting, Melissa presented what she called a competitive analysis, complete with charts and graphs that supposedly demonstrated the challenges facing smart home technology adoption. Her presentation was professionally prepared and superficially convincing, but I could see that her data was selectively chosen to support her predetermined conclusion. She had ignored positive market trends, dismissed successful competitor products, and inflated the projected development costs by including expenses that had nothing to do with my project. Richard, clearly trying to please his new girlfriend, began to echo her concerns. He started asking for additional reports, requesting more market research, and imposing new deadlines that seemed designed to slow down the project's progress. I worked even harder, staying until midnight most nights, determined to prove that my innovation was worth the investment. My girlfriend Sarah started complaining that I was never home, but I knew this project could secure our future. The additional reporting requirements were particularly burdensome. Melissa demanded weekly progress reports that included detailed technical explanations, market analysis, and financial projections. Each report took hours to prepare, time that I should have been spending on actual development work. She would respond to these reports with lengthy emails full of questions that demonstrated her fundamental misunderstanding of the technology, forcing me to spend even more time on explanations and clarifications. During this period, I began to notice that other employees were distancing themselves from me and my project. Colleagues who had previously expressed enthusiasm for the smart home system started avoiding conversations about it. Some of them mentioned privately that they had been advised by management to focus on more immediate priorities rather than speculative research. The isolation was psychologically devastating, making me question whether my work was actually as valuable as I had believed. The stress began affecting my personal life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sarah and I started arguing more frequently, usually about my long hours and obsessive focus on work. She pointed out that I had become defensive and paranoid, constantly worrying about office politics instead of enjoying my achievements. My sleep patterns were disrupted, and I found myself checking work emails at all hours, looking for signs that my project was being undermined or canceled. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during what was supposed to be a routine progress meeting. I had just finished presenting the latest test results, which showed that our system was performing better than any competitor on the market. The demonstration was flawless, with the smart home prototype responding accurately to voice commands, learning user preferences in real time, and seamlessly integrating with over 50 different device types. The room was silent as the executives absorbed the implications of what I had achieved. For a moment, I thought I had finally convinced them that this project was worth pursuing. Several board members asked detailed technical questions that showed genuine interest and understanding. The chief financial officer even made comments about potential revenue projections and market penetration strategies. I felt a surge of hope and vindication after months of doubt and political maneuvering. Then Melissa cleared her throat and stood up, her blonde hair catching the fluorescent lights as she moved to the front of the room. She had prepared a presentation that she claimed to share, pulling up slides that I had never seen before. The presentation was titled Market Realities and Resource Allocation, and it systematically dismantled every aspect of my project. She had clearly invested significant time in preparing her attack, complete with professional graphics, industry statistics, and financial modeling. She argued that the smart home market was oversaturated, that consumers weren't ready for such advanced technology, and that the development costs would be too high to justify the potential returns. Each point she made felt like a personal attack, but she delivered them with the confidence of someone who knew she had the CEO's ear. The worst part was watching Richard nod along with everything she said, despite having enthusiastically supported the same ideas just months earlier. Melissa's presentation included customer survey data that allegedly showed limited interest in advanced home automation features. She cited reports from consulting firms that predicted slower than expected growth in the Internet of Things market. Most damaging of all, she presented financial projections that showed my project consuming resources for years without generating significant revenue. Her numbers were technically accurate but misleadingly presented, focusing on worst-case scenarios while ignoring the potential for breakthrough success. At the end of her presentation, Melissa made a recommendation that left me speechless. She suggested that Technovision should abandon my smart home project entirely and instead focus on developing simpler consumer electronics that could be brought to market more quickly. She even had suggestions for which existing products we could copy and improve incrementally, essentially advocating for a strategy of following rather than leading in the marketplace. The room erupted in discussion, with various executives weighing in on both sides. Some of the technical staff tried to defend my work, pointing out the potential for long-term profits and market leadership. Tom Morrison from the engineering department gave an impassioned speech about the importance of innovation and the risks of playing it safe in a rapidly changing industry. But the marketing and finance teams, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, began to align themselves with Melissa's position. Dr. Patricia Williams, our Chief Technology Officer, tried to present a balanced perspective by acknowledging both the risks and opportunities associated with my project. She pointed out that the technical achievements were genuinely impressive and that the intellectual property value alone might justify continued development. However, she also admitted that the timeline for commercialization was uncertain and that the company needed to balance innovation with financial stability. Richard listened to all the arguments before making his decision. He announced that the company would postpone the smart home project indefinitely while they explored Melissa's alternative suggestions. My heart sank as I realized that years of work were being thrown away because of office politics and personal relationships. He tried to soften the blow by suggesting that the project might be revisited in the future when market conditions were more favorable, but I knew this was essentially a death sentence for my innovation. The immediate aftermath of that meeting was devastating. I returned to my desk in a daze, staring at the prototype devices and development documentation that represented years of my life. Colleagues offered sympathetic glances and a few expressed private outrage about the decision, but everyone understood that challenging Richard's judgment would be career suicide. The junior developers who had been working on my team were reassigned to other projects, leaving me essentially alone with my discontinued research. But Melissa wasn't finished with me yet. Over the next 2 weeks, she began to systematically exclude me from meetings and decisions related to any new projects. She would schedule important discussions during times when I was known to be unavailable, or simply forget to include me in email threads about product development. When I tried to address these issues with Richard, he brushed off my concerns and suggested that I should be more of a team player. The exclusion tactics were sophisticated and plausibly deniable. Melissa would schedule strategy meetings during lunch hours when I typically left the building to grab food. She would organize brainstorming sessions on days when I had medical appointments or other commitments that she knew about from my shared calendar. Most frustratingly, she would follow up on these meetings with detailed email summaries that made it clear I had missed important discussions about the company's future direction. I started keeping detailed records of these incidents, documenting times, dates, and witnesses who could confirm that I was being systematically excluded from professional opportunities. My notebook filled with entries describing missed meetings, excluded communications, and instances where my input was dismissed or ignored. I didn't know what I would do with this information, but my engineering background had taught me the importance of thorough documentation. The psychological impact of this treatment was more severe than I had anticipated. I began second-guessing my own perceptions, wondering if I was being paranoid or oversensitive. The isolation affected my confidence and made me question the value of my technical contributions. I found myself walking through the office halls feeling like an outsider in the company where I had worked successfully for 5 years. The situation reached a new low when Melissa announced that Technovision would be hosting a major product launch event in 2 weeks. The event would showcase the company's new direction and introduce several products that had been developed using resources that were originally allocated to my project. She had managed to convince Richard that this launch would position Technovision as an innovative leader in the consumer electronics market. The announcement was made during a company-wide meeting that I was actually allowed to attend. Melissa stood at the front of the room with a confident smile, describing her vision for an event that would attract media attention, potential investors, and key customers. She spoke about breakthrough technologies and revolutionary products, using language that sounded remarkably similar to the presentations I had given about my smart home system. What made the announcement particularly painful was learning that Melissa had been appointed as the event's coordinator, giving her complete control over every aspect of the launch. She would decide which products were featured, which employees would present, and even which media outlets would be invited to cover the story. It was clear that she intended to use this event to solidify her position as Richard's right-hand person and the face of Technovision's future. The event planning process became a daily reminder of my diminished status within the company. Melissa held regular planning meetings that included representatives from every department except mine. She brought in external consultants, event coordinators, and public relations specialists who had no understanding of Technovision's technical capabilities, but were eager to help create a spectacular presentation. I spent the next few days watching as Melissa transformed the office into a planning hub for her event. She hired external consultants, ordered expensive promotional materials, and scheduled rehearsals for the presentation team. The irony wasn't lost on me that the budget for this single event was probably larger than what I had requested for an entire year of smart home development. The main conference room was redesigned with professional lighting, staging equipment, and audiovisual systems that would allow for live streaming and professional recording. The guest list for the event was impressive and depressing in equal measure. Melissa had invited journalists from major tech publications, analysts from leading research firms, and executives from potential partner companies. Several venture capital firms had confirmed attendance, presumably interested in learning about Technovision's new product direction. The event was clearly designed to position the company for significant growth and investment opportunities. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Melissa called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week before the product launch. Her office was decorated with marketing awards and photos of her with various industry executives, clearly designed to intimidate anyone who entered. She sat behind her desk with a smug expression, clearly enjoying the power dynamic that had developed between us. The conversation began with Melissa expressing fake concern about my recent performance and attitude. She suggested that I seemed disengaged from the company's new direction and wondered if I was struggling to adapt to changing priorities. Her tone was condescending and carefully calculated to make me feel like the problem was my own inability to embrace progress rather than her systematic campaign to undermine my position. She informed me that my attendance at the product launch would not be necessary. According to her, the event was focused on Technovision's new direction, and my presence might confuse the message they were trying to send. She suggested that I could use the time to clean out my workspace and consider whether Technovision was still the right fit for my career goals. The implication was clear. I was being pushed out. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but every word felt like a carefully planned attack on everything I had worked for. Melissa made it clear that Richard supported her decision and that arguing would only make things worse for me. She handed me a formal memo documenting my exclusion from the event, complete with legal language about confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. The memo was particularly insulting because it suggested that my exclusion was in the best interests of both the company and my own professional development. It recommended that I use the time during the product launch to focus on transition planning and career counseling services that the company would provide as part of my departure package. The document was clearly prepared by legal counsel and designed to protect Technovision from potential wrongful termination claims. Walking back to my desk, I felt defeated for the first time in my professional career. I had always believed that hard work and innovation would be rewarded, but I was learning that office politics could override merit. Several of my colleagues offered sympathetic looks, but nobody was willing to openly challenge Melissa's authority. The fear of losing their jobs kept everyone in line. Tom Morrison from engineering stopped by my desk later that afternoon to express his outrage about the situation. He told me privately that several technical staff members had complained to management about the decision to cancel my project and exclude me from the product launch. However, their concerns had been dismissed as resistance to change and lack of understanding about market realities. Tom warned me that anyone who continued to support my position too vocally would likely find themselves facing similar treatment. That night, I called my father, who had immigrated to the United States 30 years ago and built a small but successful engineering firm through sheer determination. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before offering advice that would change everything. My father's story was one of perseverance against systematic discrimination and professional obstacles that made my current situation seem minor by comparison. He had arrived in Seattle with an engineering degree from Taiwan that wasn't recognized by American employers, and had spent his first 5 years working manual labor jobs while studying for professional certification exams. His English was limited, his resources were minimal, and his opportunities were restricted by both legal barriers and cultural prejudice. He reminded me that in our family, we had always believed in protecting our work through proper documentation and legal measures. He asked me if I had been smart enough to secure patents for my innovations, and I suddenly realized that I had a weapon I had forgotten about. During the early stages of development, I had filed several patent applications for the key technologies behind my smart home system. The applications had been approved 6 months ago, but I had been so focused on product development that I hadn't paid attention to the legal implications. My father explained that intellectual property protection was often the only way for individual innovators to compete against larger organizations with superior resources and political connections. He told me stories about engineers he had known who lost everything because they failed to protect their ideas through proper legal channels. The conversation was a wake-up call that reminded me I had options and resources that I hadn't been considering. I spent that entire night reviewing my patent documentation, and what I discovered made me smile for the first time in weeks. Not only did I hold the patents for the core technologies that made my smart home system unique, but those same technologies had potential applications in many of the products that Melissa was planning to feature at her launch event. If Technovision wanted to use any variation of my innovations, they would need my permission. The patent portfolio was more comprehensive than I had initially remembered. I held intellectual property rights for the machine learning algorithms that enabled predictive user behavior analysis, the communication protocols that allowed seamless device integration, the security frameworks that protected user privacy, and the user interface designs that made complex systems intuitive for consumers. Any smart home product that incorporated these features would likely infringe on my patents. More importantly, I discovered that the patent applications had been filed using my personal resources and my own legal counsel, completely separate from any company funding or support. This meant that Technovision had no legal claim to my intellectual property, despite their investment in the development process. The patents were mine to control, license, or enforce as I saw fit. The next morning, I requested a meeting with our legal department to discuss the patent situation. The company's chief counsel, Margaret Willis, was a sharp woman in her 60s who had been with Technovision since its founding. She had a reputation for being thorough, fair, and completely focused on protecting the company's legal interests. She reviewed my documentation with growing interest, occasionally stopping to ask detailed questions about the development timeline and the scope of my inventions. Margaret's assessment was clear and devastating for anyone who thought they could push me aside. My patents were solid, properly filed, and covered technologies that were essential for several of the products being developed under Melissa's direction. Any attempt to use these technologies without my consent could result in serious legal consequences for the company, including injunctions that could halt product development and financial damages that could reach millions of dollars. But Margaret also warned me that patent disputes could be lengthy and expensive, and that Technovision had the resources to fight a legal battle that could drag on for years. She suggested that I consider negotiating a licensing agreement that would allow the company to use my technologies while ensuring that I received appropriate compensation and recognition. Her advice was professionally sound but focused on minimizing risk rather than maximizing justice. I thanked Margaret for her advice but told her that I needed some time to consider my options. The truth was that I had no intention of quietly licensing my patents to a company that was trying to push me out. I had a better idea, one that would require perfect timing and a willingness to take a significant risk. I wanted to make a public statement that would expose the truth about how Technovision treated its innovative employees. Over the weekend, I prepared for what I knew would be the most important week of my career. I reviewed every detail of my patent portfolio, researched the legal requirements for enforcing intellectual property rights, and even practiced what I would say when the moment came. I also took the precaution of backing up all of my personal files and removing any sensitive information from my work computer. I spent hours researching similar cases where individual inventors had successfully challenged large corporations over patent infringement. The stories were inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. Some inventors had won significant settlements and achieved industry recognition for their contributions. Others had been bankrupted by legal fees and blacklisted from their industries. The stakes were enormous, but I felt I had no choice but to fight for my rights. Monday morning arrived with the typical Seattle drizzle, but I felt energized for the first time in months. Melissa was in full preparation mode for the product launch, rushing around the office with her clipboard and barking orders at anyone who would listen. She seemed particularly pleased with herself, probably thinking that she had successfully removed the last obstacle to her complete control over Technovision's technical direction. The office atmosphere during that final week was electric with anticipation. Employees were excited about the media attention and potential business opportunities that the product launch might generate. Catering companies were making final arrangements, audiovisual technicians were testing equipment, and public relations specialists were coordinating with journalists and industry analysts. The energy was infectious, and I almost felt guilty about what I was planning to do. The week passed quickly, with Melissa hosting daily rehearsals and making last-minute changes to the presentation schedule. I watched from my desk as she transformed the main conference room into a miniature auditorium, complete with professional lighting, cameras, and a stage that would allow her to present alongside Richard. The local tech media had confirmed their attendance, and several potential investors were expected to be in the audience. During one of the rehearsals, I overheard enough of Melissa's presentation to confirm my suspicions about patent infringement. She was describing features and capabilities that directly matched the technologies covered by my intellectual property rights. The language she used was different, but the underlying concepts and implementations were unmistakably based on my innovations. She was essentially planning to publicly announce the theft of my intellectual property. On Wednesday, I received an email confirming that I was not included in the event and should plan to work from home on Friday. Melissa had even arranged for security to be aware that I would not be attending, presumably to prevent any attempt to disrupt her big day. She had thought of everything, or so she believed. The email included detailed instructions about maintaining confidentiality regarding company proprietary information and warned about potential legal consequences for any attempt to interfere with business operations. The security arrangements were more extensive than I had expected. Melissa had hired additional guards for the day of the event and had provided them with photos and descriptions of employees who were not authorized to attend. My name was specifically mentioned as someone who should be prevented from entering the building during the product launch. The level of preparation suggested that she was genuinely worried about potential disruption. Thursday night, I barely slept as I went over my plan one final time. I had decided that the most effective approach would be to attend the event despite the ban, armed with my patent certificates and prepared to make a public statement about my intellectual property rights. It was a risky strategy that could backfire spectacularly, but I was tired of being pushed around by someone who had contributed nothing to Technovision's technical capabilities. I had prepared multiple copies of all relevant documents, including patent certificates, development logs, and legal correspondence that proved my ownership of the technologies being presented. I also had backup plans in case security prevented me from entering the building or if I was removed before I could make my statement. The most important thing was ensuring that the media and investors would hear the truth about where these innovations had actually originated. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, unusual for Seattle in October. I dressed in my best suit, gathered my patent documentation, and drove to the office with a determination I hadn't felt in months. The product launch was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock, with media check-ins starting an hour earlier. I planned to arrive just as the presentations were beginning, when the audience would be at its largest and the cameras would be rolling. The Technovision building was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Catering trucks were unloading equipment, media representatives were setting up their cameras, and several people I didn't recognize were wearing visitor badges and networking with our employees. Melissa had clearly spared no expense in making this event look professional and important. The parking lot was filled with vehicles from local news stations, and I could see camera crews preparing for live broadcasts. I waited in my car until I saw Richard and Melissa take the stage to begin their opening remarks. Through the building's large windows, I could see that the conference room was packed with attendees, exactly as I had hoped. This would be my moment to reclaim my work and expose the truth about how Technovision had been treating its most innovative employees. Walking into the building, I was immediately approached by security guards who recognized me and knew I wasn't supposed to be there. I calmly explained that I had important information about the products being presented, and that my attendance was necessary for legal reasons. The guards looked confused but allowed me to proceed while they radioed for instructions. I could hear one of them describing my appearance and asking for guidance about whether to escort me from the building. I entered the conference room just as Melissa was beginning to describe the revolutionary new technologies that Technovision had developed. She was standing confidently at the front of the room, using a laser pointer to highlight features on a large display screen. The audience was clearly impressed by what they were seeing, and several people were taking notes for their articles and reports. The presentation was professionally produced and visually stunning. Melissa had clearly invested significant time and resources in creating compelling graphics and demonstrations that showcased the capabilities of the smart home technologies. She spoke confidently about features like predictive behavior analysis, seamless device integration, and intuitive user interfaces, using technical language that she had obviously memorized without truly understanding. What Melissa didn't know was that every single revolutionary feature she was describing was covered by my patents. The smart learning algorithms, the seamless device integration, the predictive user interface, all of it was my work, repackaged and presented as if it had been developed by her team. She was essentially committing intellectual property theft in front of dozens of witnesses, including journalists who were recording everything for publication. I waited until she finished her presentation and opened the floor for questions. Then I stood up in the back of the room and raised my hand, causing a ripple of confusion to spread through the audience. Melissa's face went pale when she saw me, and I could see Richard frantically whispering to someone off stage. Security guards started moving in my direction, but they hesitated when they saw the media attention focused on the developing situation. When Melissa reluctantly acknowledged my presence, I identified myself as the senior product developer who had actually created the technologies being presented. The room fell silent as I walked toward the front, pulling my patent certificates from my briefcase. I could hear cameras clicking and see reporters reaching for their phones to capture what was clearly becoming a dramatic confrontation. I addressed the audience directly, explaining that every innovation Melissa had claimed as Technovision's breakthrough work was actually covered by patents that I held personally. I had brought copies of the patent certificates for anyone who wanted to examine them, and I was prepared to provide detailed documentation of the development timeline that proved my ownership of these technologies. The impact was immediate and devastating. The media representatives began asking pointed questions about intellectual property rights and whether Technovision had permission to use my patented technologies. Several potential investors looked concerned and started gathering their materials to leave. The carefully orchestrated product launch was falling apart in real time. Melissa tried to regain control of the situation by claiming that I was a disgruntled employee making false accusations. But when I began to recite specific patent numbers and describe technical details that only the original inventor would know, her credibility crumbled. The audience could see that I clearly understood these technologies in a way that she did not. The questions from journalists became increasingly aggressive as they realized they were witnessing a major story unfold. They wanted to know about the development timeline, the patent filing process, and the specific technologies that were allegedly being used without permission. I answered each question professionally and thoroughly, providing the kind of technical detail that demonstrated genuine expertise and ownership. Richard finally took the stage to try to contain the damage, but he was clearly unprepared for this confrontation. He attempted to suggest that there had been some misunderstanding about the patent ownership, but I was ready for this response. I explained that all of my patent applications had been filed using my personal resources, without any company funding, and that Technovision had no legal claim to my intellectual property. The questions from the media became increasingly aggressive as they realized they were witnessing a major corporate scandal unfold. They wanted to know how long Technovision had been planning to use my technologies without permission, whether other employees had been similarly treated, and what legal action I intended to pursue. I answered each question calmly and professionally, making it clear that I was the victim of corporate misconduct. Within 30 minutes, the product launch had completely collapsed. Most of the audience had left. The media was focusing on the intellectual property scandal instead of Technovision's products, and Melissa was nowhere to be seen. Richard was left trying to do damage control with the few remaining attendees, but the story was already spreading through social media and industry news sites. The aftermath was swift and decisive. By the end of that day, Technovision's stock price had dropped significantly as investors worried about potential legal liabilities. The company's board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation and determine how to respond to the crisis. Several major clients put their contracts under review pending resolution of the patent dispute. Margaret Willis contacted me that afternoon to discuss settlement negotiations. Technovision was eager to resolve the situation quickly and quietly, preferably without admitting any wrongdoing. But I was no longer interested in quiet resolutions or behind-the-scenes compromises. The company had tried to steal my work and destroy my career, and I wanted full accountability. Over the next 2 weeks, the story became a major news item in the tech industry. Business publications ran detailed articles about the importance of protecting intellectual property rights and the risks of corporate misconduct. Several employment law firms reached out to offer their services, and I began receiving job offers from competitors who were impressed by my innovations and my willingness to fight for my rights. Melissa's career at Technovision ended abruptly when the board discovered that she had been aware of my patent holdings but had chosen to proceed with the product launch anyway. Her relationship with Richard also became a liability as investigators looked into whether personal relationships had influenced business decisions. She left the company quietly, reportedly with a severance package that included strict confidentiality clauses. Richard managed to keep his job, but his reputation was severely damaged. The board implemented new policies regarding intellectual property management and employee relations, clearly designed to prevent similar situations in the future. He was required to attend ethics training and work with an independent consultant to improve his leadership practices. As for me, the resolution exceeded my wildest expectations. Technovision agreed to license my patents for a substantial upfront payment plus ongoing royalties for any products that used my technologies. They also offered me a promoted position with guaranteed autonomy over my research projects and a seat on the technical advisory board. Most importantly, they agreed to publicly acknowledge my contributions to the company's technological capabilities. The experience taught me valuable lessons about standing up for myself and protecting my work through proper legal channels. I learned that talent and hard work are important, but they must be combined with business savvy and legal awareness to succeed in today's competitive environment. I also realized that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards. 6 months later, my smart home integration system finally launched under my direction, with full credit given to my role as the inventor and project leader. The product was a massive success, garnering positive reviews from tech publications and generating significant revenue for Technovision. The company's stock price recovered and reached new heights as investors recognized the value of my innovations. Looking back on that dramatic day when I walked into the conference room with my patent certificates, I'm grateful that I found the courage to fight for what was rightfully mine. The quiet employee who used to keep his head down had learned to speak up when necessary, and that transformation changed everything about my career and my life. The most satisfying part wasn't the financial compensation or the professional recognition, although both were certainly welcome. It was the knowledge that I had refused to let office politics and personal relationships override merit and hard work. In a world where it's easy to feel powerless against corporate misconduct, I had proven that individuals can still fight back and win when they're armed with the right tools and the determination to use them. Today, I continue to work at Technovision, but under completely different circumstances. My patents have generated millions in revenue, my innovations are respected throughout the industry, and my position is secure regardless of whatever personal dramas might unfold in the executive suite. The company has learned that treating employees fairly isn't just the right thing to do. It's also good business. And Melissa, the last I heard, she was working at a much smaller company in a role with far less responsibility. Her brief moment of power at Technovision became a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing personal relationships with professional competence. Sometimes, karma works in mysterious but satisfying ways. The lesson from this entire experience is simple but powerful. Never underestimate the quiet ones, and always protect your intellectual property. You never know when you might need to walk into a room with your patents in hand and reclaim what's rightfully yours. In the end, talent and preparation will always triumph over office politics and personal manipulation.